Good morning, and welcome to what is the 10th annual conference of the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. As I'm starting, I just want to make sure that our sound is going, and someone could just slip into the chat and just explain that, or just note that the sound is working. I'll proceed. Anyone out there? Just okay, sound is good. Thank you very much. So, for those of you who don't know us, BWRC was created by New York City College of Technology to use the Brooklyn waterfront for place-based education, where we help develop an inventory curriculum about the waterfront, support research about the waterfront, and have public events such as our breakfast talks and these conferences. We were hoping to do this in person. City Tech has a great new theater. It's only several years old. We used it once for our conference in 2019, but COVID was still not cooperating. So once again, it is Zoom. But before we begin, let me warmly thank my colleagues who have worked so hard to make this conference happen. Ariel Lawson, who is on admin and will help speakers and panelists and anyone else who has a question. Jasmine Blackburn, who will also be doing admin and doing some moderating today. Our guest research scholar, Nathan Kensinger, who has written the white paper, which you will find on the website of the conference, and our photographer, whose work you will see soon, Robin Michaels, who is also a professor at City Tech's Communication and Design department. So, Hurricane Sandy caught our attention a few months short of a decade ago. Hurricane Sandy also taught some of us a word that we had not heard before: solastalgia, the pain of watching an environment change and degrade. We might be using that word a little in our discussions today. And it has been said that Hurricane Sandy was global climate change's calling card to New York City. Today, we're going to speak not on a global scale, but we'll be looking at a slice of Brooklyn's waterfront, BWRC's focus and the focus of the conference. We will be looking at a global issue in a very local way. The day will have a simple structure. We'll be talking about Jamaica Bay and the Brooklyn communities adjacent to it. The first panel will focus on the bay and talk about Sandy. The second panel will focus on the communities and talk about Sandy. In short, we will look at the past, the present, and the near future. But then we'll pivot to what science can tell us about changes to the bay and what it might be like at the end of the century, in 2080, 2090, 2100, and beyond. So that's where we will be taking this conference. So the second part of the day will examine what those changes to the bay might mean for Brooklyn communities of Jamaica Bay. You know, when the topic of climate change and retreat or migration comes up, most of us think of international refugees, some of whom come to the United States to avoid drought and floods and desertification and fires or other consequences of climate change. But actually, such migrations are already going on in places throughout the US, and we'll hear about some of those places that are close to us here in Brooklyn. So the questions that we raise today might, if there is something like this migration, retreat, movement in the future of Jamaica Bay's communities of 2080, 2090, 2100, What kinds of plans should we be making now? What kind of discussion should we be having? And maybe as we approach the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, this might be the time to begin such discussions. And this is what we hope, in a small way, this conference can begin. Before I introduce our moderator for the next panel, as well as my colleague, I just want to mention that during the course of the day, you can use the chat function to comment on what is going on before you, communicate, say hello to friends who might be here. But the Q&A function is what we will be using for questions. And so that that Q&A function can be used. And if we do not answer all the questions, at the end of this day, we're planning to have at 3 o'clock, to have just an open discussion. People who are here can ask questions, make statements of what they've seen throughout the day. We hope to have panelists back. And so even if you have to leave for a while and you want to get back into the discussion, this almost a free-for-all at the end of the day at 3 o'clock, maybe come back and join us, or preferably stay all day, please. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce my CUNY colleague, Brett Branco. He's the Executive Director of Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. He and his colleagues at the Institute are perfectly positioned with their research and activities to contribute to our discussion today. Besides directing SRIJB, Brett is a marine scientist and an associate professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He was appointed director of the Institute in 2019, and his research focuses on the impacts of urbanization and climate change on estuaries surrounding communities. He holds a PhD in oceanography from the University of Connecticut. And so it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Brett Branco.
Good morning, Richard. I'm unable to start my video, so I'll be off camera unless someone can change that setting. Oh, okay, here we go. Great, here I am. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for that introduction, Richard. You know, I want to actually start by thanking Richard, Ariel, and Jasmine from the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center for putting together what really promises to be a comprehensive discussion of the challenges facing Brooklyn communities surrounding Jamaica Bay, you know, due to sea level rise. I really want to highlight the diversity of backgrounds, knowledge, and experiences represented by today's list of speakers. I think that the organizers really did a remarkable job assembling this group of individuals to share their collective knowledge. And I'm also pleased to see so many past and present contributors and partners of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay on this agenda. People like Eric Sanderson, just looking at the screen now, Eric Sanderson, Don Riepe, Harold Jones, Maria Garrett, on and on. There's a lot of people on today's program that have some connection to the work of the Science and Resilience Institute. So that's really pleasing to see. You know, the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay were planted in 2012, even before Hurricane Sandy. And I think that's an important thing to remember. The seeds were planted before Hurricane Sandy made landfall that October. New York City and the National Park Service already thinking about the challenges that climate change and urbanization. The rich ecological systems of Jamaica Bay, which I like to think of our own backyard rainforest in terms of their ecological importance, and the communities that surround it, the rich, vibrant communities that surround the Bay. So the New York City and the National Park Service tasked CUNY and a consortium of partners that include Columbia, Cornell, Stony Brook University, Stevens Institute of Technology, Rutgers University, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and New York Sea Grant, with creating a hub for resilience research and engagement to support the difficult decisions that lay ahead. Hurricane Sandy put an exclamation point on this need for sure, right at the same time that the Institute was created. And 10 years have passed since that tragedy of Sandy, and a lot has been done to prepare us for the next hurricane, but a lot more work lies ahead. But hurricanes aren't the only threat to the Bay and its communities. For example, many communities around Jamaica Bay already experience frequent flooding just at high tide during full moons and new moons, or during winter storms, and during cloudburst rainfall events, as Ida demonstrated this past summer. And this fact is partially a result of the slow, steady, and relentless rising of sea level that is threatening the safety and livelihoods of people who live and work around the Bay, while also threatening the ecosystems and rich wildlife of the Bay that make it so special. And events like today are important moments for sharing our collective knowledge and experiences. They help us identify priorities, successes, continuing challenges, and potential solutions to those challenges, which for a lot of people is the most important part, right? Using this collective wisdom to try to find those pathways forward that will help protect livelihoods and help protect the ecology of the Bay. So the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay will continue working with the extensive network of community partners, researchers, practitioners, and agencies invested in Jamaica Bay to create new knowledge that can lead to action. And to that end, I'm really excited to personally learn from all the speakers that we have today. And so without further ado, I'd like to kick off the first session so that we can start that learning. And as Richard mentioned, that first session is going to focus on the ecologies of Jamaica Bay. So I'm going to transition right away to introducing the first speaker as soon as I can pull this up on my screen. So here we go. So today's first speaker, again, someone who has a rich history with the Science and Resilience Institute, is Eric Sanderson. So Eric is an ecosystem and landscape ecologist who has extensively studied the ecological history of the New York City region. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Natural History of New York City. And if you don't have that on your bookshelf, you ought to. And he's the lead editor of Prospects for Resilience, Insight from New York City's Jamaica Bay. He is currently writing an atlas and gazetteer to the indigenous landscapes of New York City. And so Eric, I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Brett. And I'm gonna share my screen here. Oops. Ariel, it says the host is disabled participant screen sharing. So I'm gonna just speak for 10 minutes very briefly about the ecology of Jamaica Bay as soon as I can share my screen.
Richard, can you change that setting? I think that's a host thing.
While we're waiting, I just want to thank everybody for joining. You know, I think Jamaica Bay is it's probably the leading ecological asset of New York City. And not only is it an amazing place and a wildlife refuge, and studded with beautiful parks, but also it's been a wonderful place for people to live for literally hundreds of years if you go back to the Riepe times. So, all right, so I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, Richard, for doing that. And hope you all can see that. Ariel, can you see my title screen?
Yes, you're all good.
Okay, so like I said, this is going to be a very brief introduction to actually a very deep and interesting topic. So just about 10 minutes on Jamaica Bay. So just to start out, I think it's important to realize that Long Island here is an island of sand. The bedrock underlying New York City is very close to the surface in Staten Island and Manhattan and the Bronx, but it declines very sharply as we go across Long Island, particularly Western Long Island here. I hope you can see the cursor around Jamaica Bay. You know, it's near the surface right at Ravenswood, but by the time you get out underneath the airport at John F. Kennedy Airport, it's more than 1,400 feet below the surface. So there's this sloping bedrock platform on which a whole series of glacial events over the course of the Pleistocene and earlier times have laid down beds of sands and sediments, gravels and so forth that create this long shape. And in fact, those processes are still happening. The sand is still being deposited and still being reworked constantly by the water. And that's creating this very long structure you see here on the southern shore, which is the barrier island system, which is nature's way of protecting the south shore of Long Island. If I zoom in a little bit, this is our reconstruction of the historical topography of the New York City region, circa around 1609, around the time that Henry Hudson arrived. So here's Manhattan and the Bronx up here in Staten Island. And you can see this sort of large space here, which is Jamaica Bay. It's interesting, you know, the geologists think that once upon a time, some 5 to 10 million years ago, the Hudson River didn't go this way, but it actually went around Manhattan and created what we know as the Harlem River and created Flushing Meadow and then out through Jamaica Bay. So it's a little bit hard to realize that because subsequent glacial events have then, you know, added on top of that ancestral valley that shaped Jamaica Bay. But that's why Jamaica Bay is such a large kind of lagoonal structure compared to some of the other back bays on Long Island. And you shouldn't be confused or by this rather temporary structure, the terminal moraine that's only been here, say 20,000 years since the last Wisconsin glaciation. At the same time that these sort of surface structures are being created, the sea level has gone up and down. And if you imagine back 20,000 years ago when the glaciers were here, the sea level was actually much lower because so much water was locked up in the freshwater, so much fresh water was locked up in the glaciers. So this is our reconstruction of the shoreline of 20,000 years ago as compared to the modern shoreline today. So which is just to say, you know, Jamaica Bay is about here. So you would have had to go about 100 miles to reach the shore. So at this time, 20,000 years ago, you know, there would have been ice right above where Jamaica Bay is. And the Jamaica Bay would have been a valley full of like sediments and glacial rivers coming down. And then those rivers would have been wending their way across the coastal plain to eventually reach the shelf limit over here. And then as the glaciers retreated and the ice melted away, of course, the sea level started to change and it came up. And it came up to about where it is today, some 10,000 years ago, which is shown in this graph here. This x-axis is the time before present. So this is 20,000 years ago coming up to the present. And you can see how much lower the sea level was. It was 120 meters lower. It depends a little bit on how you reconstruct it. You know, there's a whole science and it's not super precise the way we can reconstruct these, but depending on how you reconstruct it, the sea level is 100 to 120 meters lower than it is today. It rose up over the sort of the 20,000 to 10,000 year period. And then it's been sort of gradually changing since, both as a matter of sea level rise and climate change, but also as changes in the land surface as the land has been released from the weight of the glaciers. And so the ecosystems that would form on the edge of the sea and on the edge of the land are essentially two categories. We have salt marshes like you see on the left here. You know, salt marshes grow in the intertidal zone. They're plants that are specially adapted to being flooded twice a day by the tides, and not just flooded, but flooded by salt water. So they have to have all these special adaptations to get oxygen down into their roots, and also to be able to extrude the salt that they know that they can't live. And so because of that, salt marshes are, you know, tend to be kind of low species diversity ecosystems, but high biological productivity. And then behind them, you would have these kind of maritime forests that would be affected by the sea spray. And these forests and wetlands and the beaches, like you see on the right side, this combination of ecosystems existed all the way out, you know, on the coastal shelf. And as the sea level rose, it moved inland. It moved inland over 100 miles until it got to where it was, say, 400 years ago. And not only is this a matter of the plant life, the salt marsh grasses or the beach grasses, as you see here, that help form dunes, but of course, there's all kinds of animal life that's also adapted to it, like this, you know, beautiful diamondback terrapin, which is a turtle that actually lives in the salt marshes and has these special adaptations. In fact, the diamondback terrapin has this very, I think, kind of poetic adaptation, which is that to get rid of the excess salt, it actually cries it out. Its tears are salt laden. as are ours for that matter. And then there are other species like exemplified by the sanderling that of course use the coastal environment, but when a big storm comes or some sort of disturbance event, they have a way to get away. And in the case of these little sanderlings, it's their wings. You know, they literally fly away, and then as soon as the storm is done, they fly back, and then they proceed their activities. And I mentioned this because I think they provide a nice kind of conceptual framework for thinking about our options as human beings, which don't have special adaptations to living in salt water and being flooded twice per day. I mean, we can either stay and build structures that can withstand those conditions, or we build things that we can move and then they can come back. So stay or go. I mean, I think these are really the alternatives facing us. You know, for the Riepe, they didn't live on the beaches and they didn't live in the salt marshes. They lived in the forest. There have been people in the New York City region for about 8,000 years, and the Riepe for several thousand years, several of the last 1,000 years, or other cultural groups probably before them. They had a very interesting life, a very abundant life. I don't really have time to talk about it in much detail, but I just wanted to mention that this word Jamaica, of Jamaica Bay, is actually derives, people think, from a Lenape word, the Lenape word Tamakawi, which I'm not quite sure how to say, so excuse my Algonquin pronunciation. Tamakawi, which means beaver. It's associated with beavers, associated with a particular pond that's actually near where the kind of town center of old Jamaica is. It became Yamaiko in some of the old documents, and then Jamaica. So it has nothing to do with the Caribbean island, although it's interesting just to note that the name Jamaica and the Caribbean island is also a mispronunciation of an indigenous name from the people that live down there. So the Lenape would have lived in the forest, but on the edge of the bay back here. So not in the salt marshes, but in the upland. And this is actually a rendering we did a couple of years ago of the Canarsie Peninsula, which had a large Lenape village down at its southern end. And you're looking across these vast salt marshes that would have had these large tidal creeks running through them. All of these have names that I'm writing about for my gazetteer, and would have been super productive places for oysters and mussels in the water, especially in these kind of coastal bays with some freshwater inputs. And then, you know, great places to hunt and to fish. Really productive environments on the edge of the bay. So in a sense, we have this system that's designed by nature to protect itself. And there's kind of three elements of that protection. One is the beaches, which are in motion all the time. This is our best reconstruction of what the bay might have looked like 400 years ago when the Europeans first arrived. So a dune-studded barrier island system that's in constant motion depending on the tides and the storms, backed by salt marshes, which, you know, are adapted to being flooded by the salt water, surrounding a kind of large lagoonal system, a sort of back bay system. And so, you know, in the past, there would have been storms. They would have, you know, changed the beaches. They would have flooded the salt marshes, and then the water would have just flowed back out into the ocean. Needless to say, the Europeans knew nothing about this when they first arrived. You know, they kicked the Lenape out by force, essentially, and by, you know, cultural power. They like the salt marshes a lot. You can see on this map from 1651, they're already clearly marking them. And that's because they were so productive for harvesting to feed their cows and their pigs. They would harvest the salt hay. Another great thing about looking at these old maps is you can actually see various evolutions of the coastal shoreline, recognizing, of course, the mapping techniques in the 17th century and the 18th century are not what they were in the 19th and 20th century. But you can see like Barren Island has different shapes, or here in 1811, you can see the salt marsh islands in the middle of Jamaica Bay start to form as the Rockaway Peninsula extends out. Barren Island, there was this long point briefly called the Pelican Bar that has subsequently disappeared. This is her remapping about 30 years later. You can see it's starting to disappear, and inlet forms, which then gets filled in here. And you can really see this in the coastal charts. The United States has this great tradition of coastal mapping that started in the 19th century. And we have a whole series of these coastal charts that'll actually allow you to see both how the Rockaway Peninsula is evolving out over time, how these marsh islands and the extensive marshes in the southern part of Brooklyn are changing over time, but also give you a sense of the land use. I'll just go back here. This is 1844, you know, Brooklyn's up here, Manhattan's up here. All of this is basically farmland with these massive fringing marshes. Pretty much the same thing in 1882, but you can see that Brooklyn is starting to expand. The railroad has been built across Long Island. It's these sort of outlying farming villages are starting to build up. By 1907, now, you know, we're starting to get the subway and the streetcar lines, and we're sort of getting more development. And of course, this sets in motion this idea of making Jamaica Bay into a port, which is, this is sort of an early 20th century idea that got started, but then never came to fruition. The idea is that New York's second port wouldn't be Newark over here, it would be Jamaica Bay. And so they started dredging these channels. These are our grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and creating bulkheads to try and make this port, which never quite came to be, but in the process left a lot of large-scale ramifications, which we're still dealing with. It sort of set the stage for Robert Moses to come in and build the Belt Parkway, and actually led eventually to the development that we know today that goes right up to the very edge of the water, in many places on top of those old salt marshes. So just to conclude, you know, if we look at the historical topography again of 400 years ago, you can see these thin barrier islands backed by salt marshes, backed by these kind of this really lovely sinuous meandering coast of islands and archipelagos and peninsulas, which was a wonderful place for the Lenape to live, but also the other animals, the diamondback terrapins and the sanderlings, and hundreds, maybe even thousands of other species. And then on top of that, we've laid over the last 400 years, the building footprints of the city, and, you know, completely reconfigured the shoreline, but also hardened the shoreline and tried to stop this process that has literally been going on for millions of years. And I think that really sets up the conversation today, because of course, the sea continues to rise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Always fascinating to have that retrospective look back to the evolution of the bay. So thank you. And just a reminder to everyone, we're going to take questions at the end after all the panelists have presented. So share them in the chat, share them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get them at the end of this panel. Our next speaker is Don Riepe. So Don is employed as the Jamaica Bay Guardian for the American Littoral Society. In 2003, he retired from the National Park Service, where he worked as a naturalist ranger and manager of the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge in New York City. Don has written many articles on natural history subjects, and his photographs have been published in many journals, including Scientific American, National Wildlife, Audubon, Defenders, Underwater Naturalist, Parade, and the New York Times. He has a master's degree in natural resource management from the University of New Hampshire. And it's always my pleasure to listen to Don talk. So Don, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully, I'm gonna have my slideshow. I'm going to start slideshow from beginning. Can everybody see that? Hello?
I don't think your screen is shared. Maybe try.
Uh-oh. Internet connection is unstable. So anyway, I hope this is one of the slides. Anyway, this a look at Long Island, which is like a big fish. It's the end of the Great Glacial, this area up, and on the little sticks on the edge there on the bottom part of the island are all these barrier islands.
Don, we can't see your screen yet, actually.
You can't see it?
We can't see your screen yet. Yeah,
Oh,
maybe
no.
try resharing it.
What happened? God, hang on, let me go back. You can't see that? No? That's weird.
No, I think try from the green button again on Zoom.
What happened? Yeah. Can't see any of that, huh?
Do you see the
Now I'm
green
gonna have
button on Zoom? Do you see the green button on the bottom of your screen on Zoom? If you try to use that one again, it might work.
Let me talk to Alex. You know what?
Okay.
You know what? Why don't you go to the next speaker? Come back to me. Would that work? Hello?
Okay. Okay, Brett, I guess we can do that.
Yeah,
Is-
that's fine. Maria, that's going to be you. So I'm gonna so we'll let me introduce Maria. So Maria Garrett is the president of the Fresh Creek Civic Association in Canarsie, Brooklyn. Born and raised in Brooklyn, Maria has been a longtime advocate for preserving green spaces in Jamaica Bay. The Fresh Creek Civic Association started as a local community beautification project to help mitigate issues of dumping and flooding that have caused the creek to become a neighborhood nuisance and an eyesore. With Maria's dedication and hard work, the project has since transformed into an active community organization that has hosted numerous cleanups in the area and has caught the attention of elected officials. In May, Maria secured a significant federal grant to begin constructing tidal gates to protect Fresh Creek from some of their flooding issues. And so without further ado, it's all yours, Maria.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me today. I started back in, I guess, say 2009. I became aware of the deterioration of the creek. And that's when I learned that it was part of Jamaica Bay, that it was an inlet from Jamaica Bay. And that's when I started realizing that the area was neglected. And we were getting flooded here in Canarsie. We was getting flooded and no one knew why we was getting flooded. We was basically getting flooding from the catch basins, and sometimes the tide would get so high over by the creek that it would fall into the catch basins and then flood into people's homes. And I had started bringing this attention to the elected officials, the Parks Department, because I didn't know who was responsible for taking care of that area. And when I, went to my community board, they told me that it was federal because of the water. And then I went to the city. They said that the Parks Department couldn't go across the barrier, that they was only going to take care of the outer part of the bay, of the creek. So I'm like, so who's going to take care of the deterioration? We had Phragmites, mudwort, that was growing invasive species. So what I did was I went to quite a few meetings and I was able to secure a capital project to restore the nature preserve. But in the interim, Sandy happened. So 2010 is when they decided that they was going to restore the marsh and clean up the Phragmites and restore the preserve. But Sandy hit. And that's when the whole community got flooded. And so now that made the residents realize that there was a creek over there, because a lot of people that lived on 105 or lived in the 80s or the 90s, they didn't realize we had that body of water. And Canarsie is surrounded by 3 bodies of water: Jamaica Bay, Padgett Basin, and the Fresh Creek. So the governor came in and he started a program, a commission for the community to find out what was going on. And they allocated a certain amount of money, which was, I think it was about $14 million. They gave us to allocate for different programs. And one of the programs was the coastal protection at the nature preserve. So that happened in 2015. So how many years was that after Sandy? they had the Army Corps engineer coming in. I have worked with the Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and he never forgot that we needed this funding. With the governor and with the Congress, they allocated funds for us to start the project. So the project was started actually in November of 2021 to form tide gates. Now the tide gates, they went in from Avenue K, K, L, M, N, and Seaview Avenue. What they did was, and I'm sorry I don't have the pictures to share with you guys, but this week I've been overwhelmed with quite a few things. But what they did was they put in these chambers, okay, to connect from the creek and the sewer system. So this way, if we have a surge, if we have a large surge, the water will be trapped within that chamber. And after a high tide or a surge, they will be able to open up that flap, and the water will remain in there. This way we won't flood in the community. So hopefully we're praying that this happens, but we need additional funding to finish up those tide gates. So the congressman, he allocated or secured another $800,000 for that project to be completed. So hopefully that project will be finished July 2022, and we will find out, and it will be just in time or just before the height of the hurricane season. So we're praying that that will alleviate some of the pressure that will come into our communities. But we're not done yet, because I think it was Mr. Eric that said something about the bulkheads. Our bulkheads really need to be raised. We really need to repair those bulkheads, because the tide chambers is good, because that's going to stop the flow of water coming into the whole community. But the bulkheads is going to stop the flooding coming in from the people that live along the waterfront. And you have, I think, 6 blocks of homes right on the waterfront that's in the cul-de-sac. And my house happened to be one of them. And so I'm going to still be campaigning and advocating for them to restore the bulkheads as well. So working with the Army Corps engineer and the congressman and our elected officials, hopefully we could get that done in the near future before another disaster happens. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. It's always fascinating to first hear, Eric's sort of really, big picture bird's eye view of the Bay, and then get this really hyper local viewpoint of what's happening on the ground. Really fascinating. So thank you for that presentation, Maria. Don, are you ready to go with your presentation, or should we move on to Rebecca first?
Hopefully I'm ready. I had everything ready. I failed to hit share screen.
All right, very well. We'll go back.
All right, so I'm going to share the screen.
The floor is yours.
So start my video. Okay, we're sharing the screen. Here is my program. Come on. Is the screen shared now?
Not yet. Yeah.
What happened? Where is it? You can't see that. Okay. I don't see the share screen anymore. What happened? It's supposed to be here. That? No?
Oh, no, yes,
Yeah,
that's it.
it's working. It's working.
Oh my God.
Just hit the from beginning button on the top left.
All
to go
right,
into
now I hit
slideshow
the
mode.
slideshow.
Yep.
Yes. Hey, there we are. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Sorry for all this. I'm 82 years old, so a lot of this stuff is a little challenging to me. I television, so. But here we are in Jamaica Bay. Actually, I live right on the bay in downtown Broad Channel, and I've worked for many years, and I've worked with all these critters, and survived the. Let's see. Come on. Yep. Very tricky here. Previous, come on. This is terrible. I normally don't have this problem. Anyway, we'll go back. This is a little closer look up at the bay. And what you're seeing is that tremendous amount of development, which filled in most of the marsh. Filled in at least probably 13,000 acres of marsh. Kennedy Airport on the right, top right, 4,500 acres of marsh. So if we could go back 100 years, this is something we'd never do, right? But it took a while for us to learn and learn how important these marshes were to do everything in the bay. Let's see if the marshes. In Broad Channel, those of us know that marshes protect the mainland. All right. So if you have substantial marshes in front of your house, it's going to protect from flooding, from wind damage, from waves. But unfortunately, when you fill in all these marshes, that leaves us open to flooding, constant flooding. And you can see on the left, there's a marsh that's fragmenting. We're losing our marshes due to a combination of sea level. Course, but also there was excess nitrogen coming into the bay from all the development. So we're trying to reverse that course and hopefully restore the marshes. So that's my street on the right, on just in that flooding day. This is before the storm. This is 8 a.m. in the morning. The storm was going to hit high tide, which was 8 a.m. in the evening. So I knew then, I said, this is going to be really serious. I put everything up and I was going to stay and watch. But I think it's raining. It's going to be dark. What's the point? So I went to my brother's house 5 miles inland, and it was hardly anything. First of all, it was a hurricane until it came on land, and it was downgraded to tropical storm. And everything was fine here. I didn't have any wind damage. I had 5.5 feet of water in the living room. So it was the extensive tide, 14-foot surge, primarily due to the size of that storm. The extremely low barometer, which allowed the ocean to rise up. This is the trail at the Jamaica Bay Refuge. So the trail breached, the storm breached the trail and connected with the West Pond. So the West Pond became a tidal lagoon. And we lost some shoreline, that same shoreline. And one of the things people ask me, what happened? What was it impacting any wildlife or anything? Well, I didn't see any dead animals, but I realized lost some shoreline, and shoreline is critical to many of these critters, like these horseshoe crabs that come ashore. Actually, a little later this month, we'll start seeing them, as they've been doing for millions of years. At the same time, shorebirds are traveling across. Those little red knots in the bottom there travel from Brazil nonstop to our shorelines, and they have depleted a lot of body fat. And they rely on the horseshoe crab eggs to actually almost double, so they can make it up to their breeding grounds. When we over-harvested these horseshoe crabs for conch bait and eel bait and also for medical reasons, and the populations crashed, and consequently the red knot population crashed. Moratorium. The Littoral Society managed to get a moratorium on harvesting excess numbers of these horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay, which is the big. And also, those shorelines are critical to the diamondback terrapin that Eric talked about. So this is the salt marsh turtle. And I actually took this photograph at the Salt Marsh Nature Center through the glass. So they're just a beautiful little animal, but they rely on the shore too. So the marshes disappear, the shorelines disappear, you're going to lose nesting habitat for the horseshoe crabs and terrapins. So here's a marsh that's been by storms, and you see it's eroding, declining. This is what a good marsh would look like, with a lot of high marsh, that's Spartina patens. And those marshes are critical habitat for many species of birds. One little secretive bird that's hard to see, but you will hear him there, is the clapper rail. And they inhabit marshes. The glossy ibis, the iconic species for Jamaica Bay, also rely on the marshes for foraging. The shorebirds will roost in the marshes and feed marshes. So marshes are critical habitat. They're the lifeblood of the bay. Without the marshes, you're going to lose a lot of these. And in those marshes, and that peat, that partially decomposing organic matter, all these ribbed mussels attach themselves. So the marsh, extremely productive habitats for everything. They're a good area for fish fry. Many species of fish that we eat actually spend part of their life cycles in these marshes. So without the marshes, not only are we going to get become more exposed to wind damage, but a lot of the shorebirds rely on them. These are oyster catchers who feed on these mussels. The gulls also feed on them in the winter. But you left how packed in these rib mussels are, and they're associated with the marsh there. On the right, you have some species of ducks. You have shovelers. Foreground, the little dark ones are black ducks, who are really denizens of the salt marshes. Without these marshes, you will lose those species as well. So what to do? So we're trying to restore them. So the Corps of Engineers comes in and brings in sand, clean fill. So it's huge, very expensive projects. We lessened the cost actually for a couple of marshes by planting them volunteers. So every summer we hire students, about 15 students, to work on planting marshes, cleaning shorelines, doing community projects. And so in this particular area, about 88,000 individual plugs of Spartina alterniflora. So these are very projects, but it was done all with volunteers. And again, in those marshes, the shorebirds rely on the marine life living in the mud in the marshes, such as these little semi-pollinated plovers. And this is Plum Beach. Marsh there I'm concerned about, that marsh that's behind. So here's your sort of barrier island here, the big sand dune there, and behind it we have a marsh that's developed, but the sand is gradually working its way around and eventually will cut off that marsh. So at the same time, with sea level rise and storm action and no marshes to protect the area, you're losing your shoreline there. Shoreline at Plum Beach worked its way all the way into the Bell Parkway, and had to be so the Corps had to come in and bring in more fill and put in some ground there to try to trap the sand. But also on the beaches, with sea level rise, we're built all the way up to the edge of the beach, so we can't, as we lose beaches, the ocean can't continue to create more beaches. It ends up hitting a bulkhead. But so we coexist for now. So here's some common terns and black skimmers on the beach with all these people. That's the Silver Gull Club in the background in the Breezy Point area. So right now we're all jammed in at the but eventually we may have to retreat. This is a little piping plover, and all these birds nest right on the beaches. They depend on these beaches for their livelihood. Without the beaches, we lose our shorelines, we lose our marshes, we're going to lose many species of birds. So along those areas, along coastal beaches, we try to build up the dune system. So the dune, while the marshes protect the mainland area, the dunes protect us from the beach erosion and storm activity on the beaches. So I'm sorry my internet is so unstable, but there it is in a nutshell, a quick and brief look at what's happening, what we're trying to do about it. It's a massive project. And, unless we really start now to prepare for this, we're going to really feel the effects, another 20, 30 years down. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Don,
Okay.
for that presentation. We have one more speaker, but in the meantime, people, if you have questions that you want to ask, feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will get to them. So so the next speaker is Rebecca Swadek from New York City Parks. Rebecca oversees an interdisciplinary team that's focused on watershed planning and protecting, managing, restoring the streams, lakes, and wetlands on New York City's parklands. She has over 12 years of experience ranging from plant taxonomy to ecological restoration, green roofs, and land management in Texas, California, and now New York, where she's been working on wetlands for the past 9 years. Rebecca holds a master's degree in environmental science from Texas Christian University and a bachelor's degree in biology from Texas A&M University. And Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'll talk to you guys a little bit today about just the work that New York City Parks does to restore wetlands in Jamaica Bay. So for those of you who don't necessarily know exactly how parks fits into the city, we're the Division of Natural Resources, and we manage the unmanaged, non-landscaped natural areas of the city, which encompass actually about 12% of parkland. And that covers about 10,000 acres of forest, 6,000 acres, 5,000 acres of grasslands across New York City overall, of which parks owns about half, about 1,500 acres of salt marsh, 60 miles of streams, and almost 1,000 acres of freshwater wetlands throughout the city just on parkland alone. A good chunk of those are naturally centered in Jamaica Bay. We own, you'll see a map later, but we own the property north of the Belt Parkway predominantly, a good chunk of the beaches, portions of Broad Channel, and then most of the Marsh Islands in particular are actually owned by the National Park Service. Another really important piece of what we do in our division that's not necessarily natural areas related, but definitely impacts the natural areas is working to install green infrastructure on our streets to help capture and absorb rainwater and stormwater that can impact water quality in the bay and also other wetlands. It's just kind of tying back to that nitrogen pollution and such that Don mentioned. So in 2021, we released the Wetlands Management Framework with our partners at the Natural Areas Conservancy. They're a nonprofit partner to parks similar to Central Park Conservancy or Prospect Park Alliance that are really focusing on natural areas in particular, which are generally under-resourced and underfunded. This framework really aims to tell us why, just kind of gives a broad overview of wetlands in New York City, why they're important, what their risks are, what the regulatory and policy history is, because they are both state and federally protected. But it also focuses on about 10 years of data collection that parks did in coordination with the Natural Areas Conservancy to help determine how we should best protect and manage our wetlands. It kind of focuses on several different protection and restoration approaches, from managing what we have, managing existing wetlands, to restoring what's lost. I'll talk a little bit more about those two in particular later when I go into a couple of specific projects. But then we also aim to ensure that parks provide safe equitable access and respite for the communities that are surrounding all of our parks. But we also aim to build and just maintain resilient parks for sea level rise and climate change. The framework also highlights a couple of priority projects and highlights what we need to reach our goals. So talks about staffing, talks about funding, and talks about the overall just policy recommendations and such that are critical to change to manage wetlands in New York City more comprehensively. So the goals from the framework, first and foremost, were just to celebrate wetlands and communicate their importance and provide a vision for the future. Our overall goals are to prevent net wetland loss and create new wetlands, improve watershed health, improve wetland health, as I mentioned, through watershed management, and also just to emphasize the connection between streams and their watersheds. You saw from Eric a lot of the just dramatic landscape level changes that have been made over the last 100 years in particular. And those changes in our landscape, the changes and alterations to our harbor have really altered the way our wetlands would normally function. So when we had tributaries, they brought in sediment that settled on the marshes and helped them raise their elevation naturally. And when when the harbor was paved and those streams and such were sewered and piped, those connections were severed, and it really altered how our wetlands can sustain their health long term. And then poor water quality, some of the photos that you saw from Don really just kind of exacerbated and emphasized to that. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure we connected in this was how practices in our built environment upstream, even outside of, Jamaica Bay proper, but closer even to the terminal moraine, actually can impact the health of the bay. We also aim to fund restoration, management and stewardship in parks, getting communities, getting the local folks who live next to these critical habitats out there and understanding their importance, learning to care for them and learning to advocate for them is absolutely critical. So, but first they have to know what they are, understand that they're not scary places, that hopefully they're safe places that they can experience solitude in. And underpinning all of these pieces is just to support the expansion of conservation policy, working with the state regulators, federal regulators, and through our nonprofit partners, improving advocacy towards their overall protection. So I'll give you a little bit of overview about what some of this data told us. So we embarked on a 10-year, not quite 10 years, sorry, several year study almost 10 years ago to evaluate the health of our streams, salt marshes, and freshwater wetlands citywide. Basically, we collected some data on how densely development was in the area, the percent cover of vegetation in each one of our wetlands, whether or not it was native Spartina, whether or not it was invasive Phragmites, and also just looking at the elevation of those systems to try to figure out which ones are most at risk. And by doing this, we were able to kind of identify set specific scores to each one of those indices and actually give a health and a threat score to each one of our streams, wetlands, and salt marshes. And so basically plotted across a matrix, you can see in the top left corner, those that are in high health and low threat, to kind of a moderate health and threat situation to low health and high threat. And basically this allowed us to kind of reconfigure our management approach with increasing intensity going down the matrix. So basically it says we should protect what is in good condition with fewer threats, manage everything in between, and really restore or reconstruct what is in really rough shape and faces significant threats. Threats in this case mostly mean either stormwater for streams, freshwater wetlands, but mostly in the case of salt marshes, we're focusing on sea level rise. So just kind of focus on give you kind of a quick overview of a couple of projects that we have completed or are in the process of starting to design and work on parklands. Most of these are done in accordance with partners. Sometimes we work independently, but it just kind of depends on the case and scenario. And so, as I said, this kind of shifted our approach in restoration, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in each individual site. But one of the key results of our study revealed that Jamaica Bay's wetlands, compared to the rest in the city, are at the lowest elevation in the tidal range. So they're the most vulnerable to drowning, which is not surprising given what we've seen in the Marsh Islands, but is somewhat, I guess, somewhat surprising considering they are a little bit more inland and they're closer connected to inland tributaries. So that's one of the things that we're focusing on, is like shifting to maintaining what we have, but we also continue to do fill removal projects to remove historical fill that was placed when the harbor was developed. And so I'll go through a couple of projects that are either completed or planned or upcoming, or a hybrid of those, starting with Forest Barrow Marsh, going all the way around to Idlewild, and then through the Rockaways Back Bay, and then up to Sunset Cove. So just a couple of examples of completed restoration projects that we've done. These are both fill removal projects, so removing historical fill that was placed in order to develop the harbor. The project at Bayswater was completed in, actually, I think both of these were completed in 2019. Bayswater was done in partnership with the Natural Areas Conservancy, which was actually funded by the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy. And these projects removed, as you can see, chunks of concrete, asphalt, and just all over poor hard sediment that was not really allowing native grasses to thrive. So this was immediately after planting. You can still see some of the little divot holes here. But basically, we just tried to aim to clean up that shoreline and restored about an acre of marsh in the process. Sunset Cove and Broad Channel was a project that we also finished in 2019, funded by many people, including the city of New York, EPA, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, but ultimately could not have been completed without the just incredible persistence, support, and advocacy from the Broad Channel community. This site was an abandoned marina that had been closed down due to historical violations through the state Department of Environmental Conservation, and had significant contaminants from decades of illegal dumping on the site. And we removed all of the shoreline debris and fill, contaminants, and much more to restore about 5 acres of low and high marsh in this area. A couple of upcoming restorations. Forest Barrow is actually one of our highest marshes, highest quality marshes, despite being in Jamaica Bay, and it provides critical habitat to salt marsh sparrow, which nests in this general area. It's at risk of becoming extinct over the course of the next 30 years because it actually, in the next 20 or 30 years, because it nests in our high marshes. And Forest Barrow Marsh, as you'll see in a couple of the next photos, had been plagued by historical marine debris, and we removed debris from a lot of this area, and we'll continue to go back in and do some restoration there. And then you'll see this piece of erosion that is one I'll focus on too. So this is an example of the debris removal area before, and or I should say, before we removed any debris, and this is it after debris removal, but before restoration. So so much marine debris sitting on this site over the course of several years really compacted the soil, and so we'll be going in to place clean sand on it, replant vegetation, and restore it to its former glory, hopefully creating additional high marsh nesting habitat for sparrows. This is directly adjacent to where the sparrows nest. There is a stormwater outfall here carrying stormwater from, I think, about, I want to say like 10 acres of the Belt Parkway. It's quite a large treatment area or discharge area, and it's been directly discharging to Forest Barrow Marsh and leaving all of this eroded. So this all has eroded in the last 40 years since the regulatory maps were drawn. There is now some pre-treatment with the reconstruction of this outfall, and so we're looking to actually place clean sand again and restore these tidal elevations and hopefully restore some marsh. That project will be upcoming probably in 2023. At Spring Creek, we're working with DEP and the Army Corps of Engineers to remove historical fill. So you can see some of these upland areas here will be dropped down in these yellow areas to create low and high marsh. And then we will also be working to restore in these green areas doing a technique called thin layer sediment placement, which basically means we'll put about 3 to 6 inches of sediment of clean sediment and soil on the marsh to restore its elevation. And that project's in design right now and will be in construction probably in 2025. Idlewild Marsh is also a critical nesting ground for salt marsh sparrow, and we'll also be doing thin layer placement there as well. A project will be in construction here this year that's kind of a pilot for trying to figure out exactly the best technique to do this thin layer sediment approach on such a small scale. And then we're working with partners at SUNY Environmental Science and School of Forestry to do additional restoration in this area where you see breeding birds. And that project will be coming up in probably 2025 as well. In Ramblersville, as you heard from Dawn earlier, there was a lot of damage during Hurricane Sandy to coastal communities. And in many cases, particularly in this community, just immediately west of JFK, many residents decided to buy out their election to buyout programs post Sandy, and the city worked with the local community board, civic association to try to determine what end uses for these spaces would be when they bought them out. And so after several years, many years, literally the last houses I think in this program were just demolished in 2020. Parks just overtook this land and will be restoring these to salt marsh. The desired end state was return. The land wants to be wetland, and so the community really wanted to ensure that it was returned to wetland and provide those buffering, storm buffering services for the rest of the community. Additionally, in Rockaway Community Park, we're going to be removing additional fill and shoreline debris throughout some of these honestly green and turquoise spaces throughout the site. And we also will be piloting a technique to restore a living shoreline in this green area right here. This is a site that used to be marsh many, many years ago and was dredged out. Didn't actually erode, but was dredged to provide access to Somerville Basin. And we're going to construct a riprap sill and actually try to restore marsh waterward throughout this area where there's a little bit of a shelf already. And that's all I've got. I'm sure there are many other projects that I missed, but that's just a quick overview for you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Lots of great work going on around the Bay. I think that it's fascinating to hear about all this stuff. I'm seeing a lot of questions are starting to appear. Oh, sorry, I was off camera. A lot of questions are starting to appear. I'd like to invite Eric, Don, Maria, and Rebecca to please turn your cameras on so we can address some of these questions. I'm going to use my perch as the moderator to ask the first one to get the ball rolling, and that's because in the context of Eric's presentation and Don's presentation, I saw, Maria, in the chat that you left a comment that says how much you love living near Fresh Creek, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit about what it is about Fresh Creek and Canarsie, that you find so special.
Thanks for that question. It's serene, quiet, and I get to see the different species of birds. We have the ingrets, I think that's what we found, doves out there, and we have the swans. So it's really very calm, and just to smell the fresh air. Like when you come into this area, it's not like being in Brooklyn. It's like you in the island someplace, and when people come over here, they be like, oh my goodness, this is so quiet, and it's such a nice, this is called the Seaview Village, and this area was modeled out of Long Island. So the home, we still have 1- and 2-family homes in this area, and I wouldn't change it for the world. I love it. I'm at the cul-de-sac. I'm right at the waterfront. So it's a beautiful place to live. And I wouldn't change it for the world.
Thank you, Maria. And Don, I know you also live on the bay. I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, I was just going to say that fresh and Brant Point and the Vernon Barbados Terra Peninsula, all those were part of a very creative program by New York City Audubon, and in combination with Trust for Public Land, they surveyed all these little bits and pieces around the bay and then fought with the status. And Fresh Creek was one of those that we managed. Otherwise, a lot of these lands would be just housing or some kind of do that. So, but Broad Channel, like you, Maria, I love living right on the bay. Just a little too close, but all our calendars have the high tides listed. So when I get up in the morning, I better check the tide. I check the wind direction. I check the phase of the moon. So if it's a full moon with a northeast wind and it's going to be a high tide, car. So that's our routine here. But other than that, it's worth it. I mean, it's just a beautiful place to be.
Thanks, Donna Maria. And I have I have a question coming through the chat, which I think is a great question. And maybe Rebecca can start, and then maybe Eric. How unique is Jamaica Bay's ecology, and what aspects make it unique? What makes it more, and what makes it more typical of other marshes and wetlands? But let's focus on the uniqueness for a bit. And Rebecca, you have experience in other parts of the country, so maybe we'll start with your thoughts on that.
Sure. I will say my only experience in coastal wetlands is definitely in New York City, so it's a little specific there. But I think we have work in the Long Island Sound and throughout Raritan Bay, Arthur Kill. I think the amount of just biodiversity that you see in Jamaica Bay is unparalleled to anywhere else in the city. The marshes here, just because of the geological context, are a little bit sandier. They more kind of are comparable to what you would see in Long Island or other Back Bay areas, where Long Island Sound is just a little bit of a different context. They're usually kind of more tucked up in coves, or once you get into Pelham Bay Park, just ecologically, you've got a rocky shoreline, which provides different habitats and different plant communities on the edge and such. But yeah, Jamaica Bay, I think, is unparalleled wildlife wise to anything. And it's also just incredible to see, literally, as you've said, what is in people's backyards. So,
I might add on to that. Thanks, Rebecca. That was really great. I might add on to that I think what makes it so special is that it's in New York City, that it's so proximal to so many people. It's, and it still is here. Like it could have been completely destroyed in the 10s and the 20s. So a lot of bad, I think a lot of bad things, or things that we would like to reverse now, did happen. But in fact, there's a little bit there still enough. And I think actually the work that Rebecca's doing, that Maria's doing, that Don is doing is actually so brave and so valiant, actually, considering both the historical changes and the future changes that are still coming. The other thing I might say about it is just to point out about the airport that, the reason John F. Kennedy Airport is there is because, by the time we all wanted air travel, it was relatively late in the development of New York City. It was in the 1940s and 50s that commercial air travel happened. And, JFK Airport is a globally important location in the world economy, right? It's hugely important for New York City's economy, but it's really important for the global economy. And yet there's no value of JFK Airport that returns to the Bay, which actually absorbs so much damage for having the airport there. And I think we need to fix that. I think we need to find a way to connect our economy to the ecology that makes the economy possible. John Waldman and I suggested a few years ago a very, very small tax that could be on every ticket that go back to fund the good work that Maria is talking about and that Rebecca is talking about and that Don is talking about. You know, $1 per ticket on everybody who flies in and out of Jamaica Bay would generate, you know, $40 to $60 million a year to support the efforts. And so Rebecca and Maria and Don wouldn't have to go begging to the EPA, to their local congressional constituencies, to the state legislature to get the money. I mean the
Yeah, it's
amount
such
of
a simple
bureaucracy and
idea.
work that's required. Yeah. Anyway, just to say, we need to find these mechanisms in order.
We really should push that
transform it.
idea.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for those responses. I'm looking at the time and we're just about out of time on this panel. I do have one very quick question. Two people asked of Rebecca, what is turquoise space? People were interested in that term.
I think it was just a color on the map. It was part of the green and turquoise that you were seeing on the map in that specific spot for wetland restoration and enhancement.
Okay.
Sorry,
okay.
breezed through that too quickly.
Yeah, no worries. I think we're out of time for this panel. There's lots of still great questions in the Q&A that I think we can get to later in the program, especially at the end. But for now, I'm going to turn things back over to Richard to move us along in the program. So thanks again to all the speakers. Really appreciate all of your insights. I think it was fascinating to listen to. So thank you.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, panelists. When we were designing this, what we were hoping was for just this, that is, to have our first panel give us a feel of the bay as a bay. So before it was anything, it was a bay. It was this place on the shore before settlement. Eric took us back to thousands of years ago. And it is this place that we're focusing on today. And so from the past, by the end of the day, we'll be even looking further in and into the future. And so thank you, Maria and Rebecca and Eric and Don and Brett. And by the way, I don't know how many of you yesterday caught any of the news conference of the National Science Foundation and all these scientists around the world talking about the enormous black hole that they have discovered in the center of the Milky Way. And this is, in terms of physics and what humanity knows about the universe, a great step forward. And in the midst of that, during that presentation, guess what? The speakers had some problems with their slides. And so I said, oh, if anything like that happens to me and to us tomorrow, I will make sure that to let everybody know we're in good company with the National Science Foundation and the top scientists in the world. So thank you. And what we are going to do now, we're going to give you a break until about 10:45. During that time, go up, get your coffee. We are sorry we're not in person, so we can't give you chocolate chip cookies and coffee and juices and fruit. Notice which I mentioned first, but you can go get a coffee. We will also be showing a film now, and it's called By Way of Canarsie, with directed, it's a short directed by Emily Packer and Leslie Steele, who've graciously allowed us to screen this. And now, if all is going well, at the back end, Ariel and Jasmine are going to get that film on our screen.